when it comes to New Year, I also almost never stay up to see the New Year in. And I realize that's very lightweight. And you might say, well, you're getting older. I never used to do it when I was young, because I used to go to bed around 10 or 10:30, and that just seems really late to me. And New Year has always been slightly depressing for me. I'm not sure exactly why. Now, for sure, many things I'm thankful for in this last year, not least coming to Central. And it's been a wonderful year, but I'm often aware, particularly on New Year's Eve, of the things that I haven't done. Maybe the goals that I set for 2014 that I didn't achieve, or mistakes that can't be taken back, some things said that can't be unsaid. And that always leaves me with a little sense of regret. And I'm sure you can empathize with that. As you reflect back on the year that's gone, some mistakes were made and you wish some things had gone differently. But now we're in a new year. There are new opportunities to get things right, or wrong, I suppose. New habits to establish. A new track record begins. And we're starting a series today called New Beginnings. And it's going to look at people in the Bible who made mistakes, who got things horribly wrong. We can sometimes be under the illusion that, I wish I could be like one of the great biblical heroes. And there are actually very few of them, apart from Jesus himself, who have an unblemished track record. Usually, they're both heroes and villains in the same person. And we're going to look at some of these heroes of the Bible and see how they made mistakes, they got things wrong. In some cases, they were just the victim of circumstances that were no fault of their own. And we'll find out that in each case, God can do amazing things with failure, that he is capable of bringing out the best of less than promising circumstances. So today we're going to look at the story of Joseph. So this story takes place in the book of Genesis. You'll get there soon enough if you're doing the chronological Bible reading. And today we're going to cover chapters 37 to 50. So I'll start by reading those. You laugh now. No, actually you didn't laugh. But anyway, you are actually going to get a lot of Bible this morning. So if you're asking yourself the question, is this really a Bible-believing church? You're going to hear plenty this morning. Enough Bible to choke a donkey with. So, it's a strange analogy. Number one on your outline, are you capable of messing up? Are you capable of messing up? Those of us that aren't are deluded, and that in itself is a mess up. So nobody escapes this. I know the older I get, the more aware I am of my own frailty as a human being, the mistakes that I am capable of making. I think when I first became a Christian at age 20, I thought, it'll take 1 or 2 years to sort out the sin in my life, and then I'll be invincible Christian hero from that point on. And I'm still waiting. It's not quite happened for me yet. And some years I feel that I've made real progress in some areas, and other years I feel like I've stood still, or even worse, slipped back in some areas. And when I look over my life, I've messed things up in my marriage, I've messed things up in finances, I've messed things up in ministry. There could be quite a catalogue of mess-ups. I was thinking recently, now that I'm approaching the grand old age of 50, of writing the first few chapters of my memoirs. And I started thinking through what some of the highlights and the lowlights would be, and I decided, no, it's better for that stuff not to be known until I die. So there will be a secret box somewhere to be revealed. But I'm aware, as many of us are, of our propensity to fail. And we see in this early story of Joseph that he gets some things wrong pretty soon on. I'm going to start reading in chapter 37. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. So Joseph is grassing out his brothers, which is an interesting start. Now Israel, that's also the name for Jacob, that's his nickname, loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Joseph, at this point in his life, is not very smart. Probably the phrase sibling rivalry had not been ever uttered back then, but there was certainly some sibling rivalry. He was already the favorite, and he knew it, and his father gave him a coat, a very special one, a technicolor one, if some stories are to be believed. And the brothers don't like him, and to make things worse, he exalts himself above his brothers in the telling of this dream. If you have a dream like that where you're going to be ruling over those around you, it's probably best to keep it to yourself, especially if they don't like you already. It's not going to go well for you. So we see that envy can get you into trouble. The brothers are envious of him, but so can arrogance and a lack of modesty, which Joseph exhibits here. So this is what happens next. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." A cistern, by the way, is like a well. It's not like the back of your toilet. You can fit a very ferocious animal in one of those, but it's like a well. When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the desert, but don't lay a hand on him." Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take them back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the richly ornamented robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. Now the cistern was empty, there was no water in it. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. And what happens next in the story is they dip his richly ornamented robe in blood and then bring it back to his father and basically say he's been killed by a wild animal and there's nothing left but the robe and the blood. And the father is, of course, devastated. And Joseph, before these slave traders come along, is in the dark of the pit. Sometimes where we end up is our own fault, and sometimes it's because of others. And it's important to know the difference and take responsibility for our part. If we don't, then we won't change and we'll keep ending up in the same place. There are some people who have a victim mentality, and everything bad that happens to them is somebody else's fault. And while that's psychologically comforting, the result of it is it leads you to believe that you're just a victim of circumstances and nothing you do can make any difference. It leads you to passivity, which is very unhelpful when you're trying to live out what God wants for your life. It's not a good place to be. So the brothers betrayed him, his own flesh and blood. Those who you would generally think would protect you and be on your side, but family's not always like that, is it? We know that. If I were to ask you, of the emotional wounds that you have ever received, how many of them were from random strangers on the street and how many of them are from family members? Overwhelmingly, it would be family. The people closest to us are also the people that have the greatest capacity to hurt us, and we them. People we trust do let us down. There are broken relationships and feuds over silly and minor issues. There are times when family members don't talk to each other for years because of a minor dispute. And somehow pride gets in the way, and one of them will say, "Well, I'm not going to reconcile until he admits that what he did was wrong." And the other person is too proud to ever admit that, and so the breach remains. Now, in Joseph's case, there is favoritism, where one feels that the others have been treated better than him or her, or loved more by the parents. And issues crop up. Issues, for example, on how to raise kids. We raise children differently now than perhaps our parents did, than perhaps the parents did before. In fact, if you look at the safety regulations around children now and what was 2 generations ago, it's amazing that anybody survived, really. You know, seatbelts for many of you was your mother's arm whipping across the seat and holding you in place. But these days, there are all sorts of laws about that sort of thing, and people frown upon it if you don't have In fact, they wouldn't even let us leave the hospital with our first child until we showed them an approved baby carriage that fit in our car. That's what it's got like. And we couldn't just take our child out of the hospital. Our child was like GPS tagged, and if you went over a boundary on the maternity floor, all sorts of alarms would go off and lockdown would happen. Amazing. It's very different, but sometimes there's difference in styles of parenting, and sometimes your parents have an opinion about how you should raise your children, or your in-laws do, and it doesn't match what you and your spouse want to do. And that can cause some friction. Their advice is unwelcome, but if you reject it, then there's a break in the relationship and things can get chilly for a while. Or perhaps there are boundary issues over who should go where at Christmas or Thanksgiving. Have you ever had the "but we always" sort of conversations? And then you get married and now you don't always, you every other year always, and things change. And simple things about, are people allowed to come over unannounced or not? And it can cause tension in a family, huge rifts. So family isn't always the safest place, as Joseph found out. So some of you may be in the dark of this pit where family has let you down, where people you trusted have not proven worthy of your trust, where relationships are broken or wounded. But in the darkness of the pit, like Joseph, do you still dare to dream? This is where the story goes next. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So he left in Joseph's care everything he had. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. So that's a pretty sweet gig, if you've got someone like Joseph taking care of everything for you. At this point, things are going fine. He's still a slave, but he's really more of a servant, and he ends up with a lot of autonomy and authority. God is granting him success. He gets promoted, and everyone around him within his circle of influence is blessed. So far, so good. But then a woman comes into the mix. It's going to be trouble. It isn't always, but it sometimes is. Now Joseph was well built and handsome, and after a while his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. So he's very noble. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How could I then do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. One day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." As that Shakespeare said, "Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned." That's exactly what's going on here. She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him this story. "That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." When his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me." He burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. So this is what it's like when you fall from the heights, when you've experienced success and accomplishment, but then you fall a long way down. There's misunderstanding, your motives are questioned, your behavior is questioned, and in Joseph's case, although he did nothing wrong, he's in prison. He tried to act honorably, he did the right thing, but still it went badly for him. I don't know if you've ever had that happen. If you've been in a situation where you did the right thing, the noble thing, you took the high road, and it came back to bite you. And you wonder whether it was really worth it. It happens all the time. Life is not fair. Bad things do happen to good people, and good things happen to bad people, and it just doesn't make sense. And this may be where your life is at the moment. Through no particular fault of your own, you've been misunderstood, maybe even falsely accused. and your reputation may be in tatters, and it's just not fair, but there's not much you can do about it. So it was for Joseph. And the question is this: in the dark of a prison cell, in the dark of misunderstanding and false accusation, do you still dare to dream? Do you still dare to trust God? This is where the story goes next. Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master. Just occurred to me, I wonder what they did. Was it like an overcooked muffin or something? Like that was it, that's it in prison. Anyway, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the same prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. After they had been in custody for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials, who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why are your faces so sad today?" "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there is no one to interpret them." Then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. He said to him, "In my dream I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand. This is what it means," Joseph said to him. "The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison." So there's a chance. There's a chance to escape from this prison finally. Sometime later, who knows how long he'd been in there. And now there's an opportunity to do good to someone who is going to get out, a person of influence who has the king's ear, who can put in a good word for him and maybe, just maybe, get him out. But this is what happens next. Now the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position so that he once again put the cup into Pharaoh's hand, but he hanged the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. He didn't remember. He forgot all about him. And so Joseph, whose hopes must have risen so high when his interpretation was proved correct, now has his hopes dashed. Not only is he now in the dark of a prison cell, he's in the dark of disappointment. A promise was made that has been broken. And some of you know what that's like, maybe professionally or even personally. Promises have been made to you that were then broken, and you are in the dark of disappointment. What about you? Is your life working out the way you hoped? I doubt it. I doubt if many of us think that divorce is going to be part of our plan, that financial troubles and pressure would come upon us the way they have over recent years, that a foreclosure would be against our name, that unemployment would happen, or if it hasn't happened, be threatened, that a beloved family member would die before their time. But here we are on the other side of that. For many of us, these things have happened, and we live in the dark of disappointment. We never imagined that these things would be a part of our story, but this is reality. This is the frequent pain of human existence. One of my favorite movies, a movie that I've watched for research purposes is The Princess Bride. Any other? Good. So it's almost a Christian movie. It's not bad stuff in there, really. But there's a great scene where Wesley says to Buttercup, "Life is pain, Highness. Anyone who says otherwise is trying to sell you something." And the older we get, the more a portion of pain becomes a part of the equation. And we know that life can be painful. So in the dark of our disappointment, do we still dare to dream? Do we still dare to trust God? What we see with Joseph is that he holds on to the destiny that God has for him. He holds on to the destiny that God has for him. Pharaoh has a dream, and I'll tell you more about the dream in a little bit, and no one can interpret it, but then someone in the royal household, I think probably the cupbearer, says, "Wait a minute, I remember there was someone who was good at interpreting dreams, and he's very accessible, He's a captive audience, and you can bring him to you, and he will interpret the dream for you. So this is what happens. So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream, and no one can interpret it, but I've heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. I was in the musical Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat. Have any of you ever seen that musical? Because you know that Pharaoh is played by an Elvis figure, right? And the next part is, I was wandering along by the banks of the river when the 7 fat cows came out of the Nile, And so it continues. And I just had to do that for you. Oh, you want more? No. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, in my dream, I was standing on the bank of the Nile when out of the river there came up 7 cows, fat and sleek, and they grazed among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows came up, scrawny and very ugly and lean. I'd never seen such ugly cows in all the land of Egypt. The lean, ugly cows ate up the 7 fat cows that came up first, but even after they ate them, no one could tell that they had done so. They looked just as ugly as before. Then I woke up. In my dreams, I also saw 7 heads of grain, full and good, growing on a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads sprouted, withered and thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 good heads. I told this to the magicians, but none could explain it to me. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterwards are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is just as I said to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming through the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered, because the famine that follows it will be so severe. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. And this is where Joseph shows that he's become a lot more clever over the years than he was earlier. And now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man. Don't know who that might be. I added that. And put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine. The plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and men shouted before him, make way! Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. The 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the other lands, but in the whole land of Egypt there was food. When all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food. Then Pharaoh told all the Egyptians, go to Joseph and do what he tells you. When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt. And all the countries came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe in all the world. What a journey. What a journey for Joseph. Thrown down a well, thinking that he's just going to die in the well. Then he's out of the well, he's sold as a slave, falsely accused of rape, thrown into jail, forgotten and left languishing there. But now this, promoted to second in command of all Egypt, effectively prime minister, chief economic planner, and famine avoider, saving the lives of millions. And then finally, in a very sweet ending to the story, Joseph is reconciled to his brothers who come to Egypt to buy food. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. When they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. Up to this point, he'd been disguising himself, but now he reveals himself. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. Tell my father about all the honor accorded me in Egypt and about everything you have seen, and bring my father down here quickly." Then he threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept, and Benjamin embraced him, weeping, and he kissed all his brothers and wept over them. Afterwards his brothers talked with him. So in all of this, Joseph believed that God had something better for him. In fact, one of the greatest verses in Genesis 50:20, he says to his brothers, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good." In other words, these circumstances that came upon that looked irredeemable, as though they could be nothing but bad, God was able to turn them and bring something good out of it. Joseph was able to look beyond his current circumstances and believe that God would do something great through his life. In all of this darkness, Joseph refused to give up. In every environment he was placed, he excelled. When he was a slave, he was the best slave. When he was put in prison, he was such a model prisoner that they put him in charge of the prison. When it came to using what God had given him, he used it to save millions from famine. And the point I want you to take home this morning is that Joseph didn't start being effective once he got out of the pit and out of prison. He didn't start making a difference once the obstacles were removed. And I think that's the way we often think about our lives. Like, if only this obstacle were not there, if only my credit card debt was gone, or if only this happened, or if only I got promoted, or if only this child would start behaving, whatever it is, then I could be effective for God. And the lesson I take from Joseph is right in the midst of difficulties and obstacles and dire circumstances, you can still be effective for God. Joseph kept on going, kept on working, kept on doing the best that he could. And God honored that and brought him to the place of the highest position of influence where he made a difference to millions. So if you want just one little phrase to take away this morning, it's this: do what you can where you are. Do what you can where you are. Because where you aren't, you cannot do anything. You know, when we set prerequisites in our life, like if this and this and this happens, then I can do something good for God, those things may never happen. And that's hard to see when you're in the well. It's hard to see that when you're looking up from the cold floor of a prison cell. It's hard to see that when you've gone through the bitterness of divorce or a custody battle. It's hard to see that when you're heading into foreclosure or when you're considering bankruptcy or you've just lost your job. But God can meet us even in those places. God can meet us in the dark and use us even there. So the question is, will we still dare to dream? Will we still dare to trust God? Will we dare to believe that God can use someone like me in the circumstances that I'm in? I'm going to show a video now. It's about a young man who faced his fair share of challenges being autistic, but the story's good. So watch that and then I'll make a few closing comments.
Grace Athena High School in Rochester, New York has a new, most unlikely hero, a special ed student by the name of Jason McElwain.
Let's keep it going.
Jason is the basketball team manager. For the past couple years, he's been assisting Coach Jim Johnson, helping with whatever the team needs.
And go! Get them motivated and hand out water and just be enthusiastic.
Enthusiastic, to say the least. Despite being born with autism, Jason's father says his son has never had a problem expressing himself at basketball games.
You know, I was always concerned that he might get a technical and they lose a game because he, start yelling or whatever.
Let's have a hard practice tomorrow, all hour and a half, and let's get ready for Arcadia. Let's go.
1, 2, 3, 2. Because he has been so devoted to the team, for the last game of the season, Coach Johnson decided to let Jason actually suit up. Not to play necessarily, just to let him feel what it's like to wear a jersey.
At least that was the plan. But with 4 minutes to go in last week's game, Coach Johnson stood up and pointed to number 52, Jason McElwain. After years of fetching water and toweling off other people's sweat, Jason was actually in a game. His first shot was a 20-footer from the right baseline.
Was it close? Did you almost make it?
I just airballed it.
I'm like, just, dear God, please, let's just get him a basket.
His second shot missed too, but the third was a charm. A three-point no-doubter. And Jason wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot.
If I wasn't there to witness it, I wouldn't have believed it,
You caught fire.
I just caught fire. I was hot as a pistol.
Jason ended up shooting 6 3-pointers, one right after the other. He had 20 points total, and each time a shot went in, his teammates and the crowd went a little crazier. His last basket, right at the buzzer, created total mayhem. Because he is autistic, Jason says he's used to feeling different, but never this different. Never this wonderful. Steve Hartman, CBS News, Rochester, New York.
I find that inspiring. I think for some of you this morning, what you need to do is draw a line under the failures and mistakes of the past. Accept the reality of your circumstances where you are right now. Do what you can where you are and experience a new beginning with God. And perhaps for some of you, that means coming back to a God that you've really held at a distance for a while. And you're thinking, well, it's the new year, maybe I need to go to church. And I'm glad you're here, and I'm sure God is glad you're here. And it's time for you to come home, to come back to the family of faith and invite Jesus back into your life. In a few moments, we're going to invite you to come forward and pray. And if there is something about your circumstances that you feel is holding you back, that you want God to deal with or enable you to be useful for him even in the midst of those circumstances, then we'd love to pray with you about that or anything else which is on your heart this morning. Let's pray. Lord God, thank you for the example of Joseph, who so many times must have thought, it's over. I'm doomed. And when he was stuck in the well and thought he was going to die there, when he was stuck in the prison, probably thought he was going to live out his life there and die, when he was forgotten, falsely accused. So many strikes against. But God, in your hands, you can do incredible things with us. And God, I thank you for each person here this morning. Thank you for the life experiences that you've given them. Lord, thank you that even in our mistakes, you can still take us and use us. And I pray that we will believe that even in the circumstances you have us right now, we will believe and hold on and trust that you can use us right where we are. In your name and for your sake, amen.